Hi there BookTube audience, and welcome to a new video. This is a tag video. This was devised by those guys at Strip Cover Lit, and it is the Buy the Bet tag. When I first saw that, I thought this was going to have some relation to gambling, but no, it's short for alphabet. In that charming way, Americans often shorten words. I saw Todd the Librarian's version and thought, this would be a good one. And it's basically just an A to Z of anything to do with books or literature that you fancy. So it can be authors' names beginning with a letter of the alphabet. I've gone slightly more conceptual, sort of literary concepts where I could. So let's get on with it. A. So A for alphabet, A for ABC. We tend to have two different types of primers, reading primers in our lives. Obviously we have the first one that teaches us to read with pictures of fluffy animals and single word pages. Like A is for apple, C is for chick and all that sort of thing. And then as we turn to face the world, our reading can really sort of shape, sort of our views on the world. So I've gone with Alexander Berkman, an ABC of Anarchism. B. B is banned books, and let's show a little love and solidarity with books that have been banned anywhere in the world because the authorities, or actually it can be members of the public who call for them to be removed from library shelves or schools. Let's show a little love for banned books. There's always a banned book week, both in the US and now in the UK, and let's get behind that. Two of off the top of my head favourite banned books: William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, and bizarrely, there were other wonderful Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, which is a great book, and it's sort of about Vietnam, about a grunt in the front line, and it's a bit sweary, it's a bit graphic because people get shot around him. And people object to that for some reason. Anyway, C. C is for Cockroach. 3 novels that revolve around cockroaches. One, of course, is Kafka's Metamorphosis. One is Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to G.H., which I just read this week and have posted a review. And I shall put a link to that. And the third is Jealousy by Alain Robbe-Grillet, where the cockroach is dead. It's actually a stain where it was sort of smashed against the wall, and that stain is very key to the sort of passing of time, measuring the passing of time, a bit like a sundial. So everything is a sundial. It ought to be said in Kafka's, his original German, the word does not necessarily mean cockroach. It's just what the English translation has made it. It's slightly sort of less certain in Kafka. It sort of means a pest, but I'm counting it as a cockroach for the purposes of this. D. Decadence. Well, there's only one book about decadence really in fiction. J.K. Huysmans' Against the Grain, cited in lots of books by lots of writers, including Oscar Wilde. If you're into decadence, read that. E. Experimental. Well, there's no such thing in literature. Because as soon as something has been done that's a bit different, never been done before, it can't be done again and still be regarded as experimental because someone did it before. So although there's a wonderful book called The Unfortunates by B.S. Johnson, which comes, it looks like a book, but actually it's a box. And inside there's sort of stapled chapters. And one is marked chapter 1, one is marked last chapter, but the rest you are encouraged to read in any order you want. I don't know if that was the first book that did that, but let's assume it was. That was probably experimental, but ever since then, anyone who does a version of it, and let's face it, in digital literature and sort of plot your own way through a novel, that happens quite a lot. It's not experimental anymore. I've got a video dedicated to B.S. Johnson, who regarded himself as an avant-garde writer. You can judge whether you think he was or not if you watch my video. F is for Fatwa. Now, I'm a writer, and I'm all about disruptive techniques and getting under people's skin and provoking a reaction. So props to Salman Rushdie, who probably took it to the nth degree when he had a death sentence pronounced on him by the Ayatollah of Iran. It's a terrible sort of state, but I bought this pamphlet, which he wrote when he was still in hiding in 1990, sort of arguing the case for sort of freedom of expression, and it's called Is Nothing Sacred? And obviously talking about his own situation. It's not a great little pamphlet, but despite its terrible condition, it's actually got footprints by the look of it on the back. It's an artifact of that time. G. growing up male in the 1970s and early 80s in the UK, I say this because at the time when I was growing up and just starting to read, there seemed to be three books that every male boy who read at all would read. One was Catching the Rye by J.D. Salinger. One is The Outsider or The Stranger by Albert Camus, and the third was The Magus by John Fowles. And it just, whenever I talk to people about the books they read, boys, I was at an all-boys school, those are the books that they read. And Camus is brilliant. Catching the Rye is very fine, although I know it annoys a lot of people. And I hated The Magus. I don't think that can still be true because I don't think boys read that much. And if they do, there's, when I was growing up, there wasn't really a sort of young adult concept, so you just read whatever you want, really. I mean, there were books for children and early readers, but there wasn't a sort of a marketing concept called young adult. So I think if anyone still reads in this country at that age, they're probably being channeled down the young adult route. Anyway, H is from Michel Faber. Am I the only person on BookTube who is an ultra fan of this guy? I know he gets up people's noses. I know he can offend people. But to me, he's a misanthrope in that sort of fine French tradition of misanthropes. But that doesn't preclude him being a writer of very, very interesting, provocative, and I think significant novels. And I'm looking forward to his new one that comes out in translation in English in about September called Serotonin, which is to do with the sort of chemicals in the brain. And I think serotonin is either the one that if you don't have enough of it, it's probably why you're an insomniac, or it's one of the pleasure ones. I can't remember now, but I'm looking forward to reading the book anyway. I is for Incarceration. Books about being imprisoned, of which there are many, but two of the finest. In the Belly of the Beast by Jack Henry Abbott, which is non-fiction. So is this one, obviously, sorry. An Evil Craving by Brian Keenan, who was one of the Beirut hostages during the civil war in Lebanon. And he was kept there for many years, chained to a radiator. His only sort of surviving strategy is in here, and it's brilliant. This is more about he spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, where there was no sensual stimulus at all. He was in darkness. There was nothing in the room except the hole for his excrement, and gradually the space between him and his excrement shortens, and he comes one with the hole. He's in the hole, which is what solitary was called, but the actual hole in his hole, he sort of merges with it. It's a brilliant book. J, junk, as in heroin. Lots of books about heroin, obviously. It's quite hard to name my favourite. Probably Kane's book by Alexander Trokey, who was a Scottish beat writer. Or what would be the other one? So I've done myself a note here. Oh yes, Hubert Selby's Requiem for a Dream, which isn't only about heroin addiction, but it's about the American dream, really. But two of the characters, they basically buy a kilo of heroin, which they're going to cut and make lots of money. But of course, they can't help sampling the merchandise. In the end, they sample it all and they have nothing left to sell. It's a brilliant sort of study of the American dream. K, kid narrators. Now, I've done a video on this, which I'll post a link to, of why I'm not a fan. But occasionally, very occasionally, it works. And one of the few examples of a kid narrator working is in Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. But, check out my video and you'll see why I'm generally quite hostile to kid narrators. L, Letters from Prison. Well, it does what it says on the tin. Antonio Gramsci, who's the most intelligent Marxist, sort of refined Marx's theories to allow a role for culture and ideas, which Marx sort of science based in his own mind didn't. But the other one is in a way is sort of akin to this, from the same era, which is George Jackson, Letters from a Soledad Brother. He was a Marxist and a sort of militant sort of black rights mover in the 60s, and he was shot in a prison riot in Soledad prison, and it was claimed that he was, basically targeted. But that's also a brilliant book, like the Jack Henry Abbott. Magical realism. No, just no. It is the worst trope of all. It may, and this is debatable itself, it may have had a context in sort of Latin America in the 70s and 80s, when you had sort of the extremes of poverty, you had political, sort of death squads and things like that, and you had liberation theology. But outside of that context, i.e. now in 2019, and by writers in the UK and in America, just no, stop it now. Never written a bad book. Well, the only author I can think of that is Michel Faber. Although I would say Clarice Lispector, I've only read 3 of her books. I need to get through more of her oeuvre, but the 3 I've read have all been superb. So she could come into that category once I catch up to the rest of her work. Oh, Oulipo. So the Oulipo movement was in the 60s, mainly in France, where there was these sorts of disciplines and outside sort of challenges which authors used to restrict, what they could write and how they could write it. So a lipogram, for example, which is one of the things that came out of Oulipo, is where you leave out an element. And the most famous one of those, of course, is Georges Perec's book, Avoid, which was a full-length novel written without a single letter E. So that is an Oulipo book. P, political novels. Well, there's a proud tradition in Britain from, Gulliver's Travels onwards of sort of politically based fiction until you get to the 20th and 21st centuries, where I've had the unfortune, or is that a word? Disfortune? Unfortune? Anyway, of reading 3 of the worst books I've ever read have all been political novels, and for some reason all written by women. I don't know if that's just coincidence. One is 10 Days by Gillian Slovo, one is Demo by Alison Miller, and the third is Doris Lessing, The Good Terrorist. They're just, dreck. I'm not kidding. They are 3 of the worst books I've ever read. Must do better, Britain. Q. I'm going the novel Q, written by the Italian arts collective Luther Blissett. Now, I've got a short video on, where that name Luther Blissett comes from, because it's a collective of people. It's not one author. But Luther Blissett is a real person, but he's not an author. He's a footballer. And in my short video, I explain the link behind that. I must say I've not read Q. R comes after Q, not P. Regrets. So 2 books that I bitterly regret giving chunks of my life up to reading are Roberto Bolaño's 266 and American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. I ploughed on to the bitter end with both and then wondered why. S. Suicide authors. Well, I've done a video on authors who committed suicide and whether we should look into their writing for clues as to their mental state that eventually led them to commit suicide. And I'll post the link to that. But you're talking Virginia Woolf, David Foster Wallace, Yukio Mishima, Primo Levi, Arthur Koestler, Ernest Hemingway. I mean, the list is endless. So again, I'll put the link to my suicide authors. T, 2 sides of a story. So there are 2 sides of every story. And there have been 2 Chechen wars between the Russians and the Chechen, looking for a sort of Republic Islamic nation. And they are, they in terms of brutality and nastiness, they make Vietnam look like a picnic. But I've read books from both sides. So Freefall, a sniper story from Chechnya by Nikolai Lilin, who was a Russian sniper in a special brigade, which is basically sort of black ops. And I Am Chechen by German Sedurlayev, who was a Chechen rebel. And I'm very obsessed with Chechnya, and these are 2 great books. Unfinished novels. Well, you read The Trial by Kafka, and it reads like a fully formed novel, but Kafka only wrote 3 novels, and all of them were uncompleted. And they weren't uncompleted because he ordered them burned after his death and all we have is fragments. They were uncompleted. So that's The Trial, America, and The Castle. And you wonder, well, Okay, he probably revised as he went along, but did that mean that he never really completed a first draft? You know, it's an odd thing to grapple with, because you know they are so sort of perfectly formed but incomplete. Very very strange sort of sensation when you read Kafka. And the other one, of course, is David Foster Wallace's Pale King. The valedictory novels, i.e., what is the best, you know, farewell final novel? And for me, this is A Gape by William Gaddis, who was racing against time in his sickbed to complete it, and it's kind of about that, but brilliantly realised. You know, it's not a sort of, you know, straight realism about a guy dying in hospital. It's just superb. It's not that long, but it's really worth reading. W, writing like their life depended on it. Well, apart from Gaddis lying in his hospital bed, writing literally because his life did depend on it to complete it before he died, I'm going to say Clarice Lispector, because her 3 books just have they just reach and grab you by the throat and shake you. Go, listen, this is, you know, this is important stuff, and I'm going to die if you don't listen to me. Extraordinary writer. X, as in XXX. Porno, so books that are essentially pornography dressed up as literature. Well, Robert Coover's Lucky Pierre, which, to be fair to it, does have literary values, but it, you know, it's sort of remorseless in its sort of sex, so it does sort of, you know, redound to the level of porno. And the other is Alexander Trocchi, who I mentioned before in Kane's book. I think he wrote this for sort of money by, you know, someone like Playboy magazine or something, basically commissioned him to write a novel, and it's called Thongs, and it's about a dominatrix. And I was only able to read it in the naughty room of the old British Library. They had a book for, not banned books, but sort of frowned upon books, and Thongs was, I had to read it in this room under the gaze of a librarian. And there were certain rules for this room that were different from others, like, you know, you couldn't work in pen. What else weren't you allowed to do? Can't remember. But there were certain, it was, you know, different. And the other time I went in there was very odd. It was for a book, you know, it was a book on tarot cards, and came with a tarot card pack. And for some reason I had to read that in the naughty books room, which I don't really understand. It wasn't even Alexander Crowley's Thoth pack. It was just a standard tarot pack. But anyway, why? Yawn. Well, what books are just boring? And to me, it's books about stoners and books about drunks. Who cares? I guess you had to have been there, and since they're fictional characters, you couldn't have been there. And the author trying to put you there, it just is boring, as is when, you know, a friend of yours, you know, tells you an anecdote of some, you know, riotous night, and you weren't there, and, you know, after the fact, it just sounds dull. And Z. Z is for zucchini, by which I mean American cousins. I love you dearly, but the word is courgette. Zucchini, you're crazy. And conceptually, it's like books that have different titles in different countries. And so the penultimate Jonathan Lethem book in America was called A Gambler's Anatomy, which is a good title because it's about a sort of backgammon hustler. So it's like totally relevant. And when I came to order it here in the UK, they couldn't find it. And that's because it had its title changed to The Blot, which is a technical term in backgammon. So again, it's relevant, although a bit more sort of esoteric, unless you're familiar with backgammon. You wouldn't know that. But I couldn't understand why they changed it from A Gambler's Anatomy, which is an okay title, to The Blot, which is bizarre. Although again, you know, metaphorically, it makes sense in the book, but until you've read the book, you wouldn't know that. So that didn't make any sense. And the other writer this happens to a lot is Victor Pelevin, the Russian writer, who has the unfortunate thing of having 3 different titles for his books. The Russian, and it's different again in America, and it's different again in the UK. So an example of this is in America, it was called Buddha's Little Finger, and over here it was called The Clay Machine Gun. I don't know why. Anyway, so that's my Buy the Bet tag. Thanks to Strip Cover Lit and Todd for keying me in. It's a really good tag to do because you can make, you know, it's A to Z, so there's no sort of preset questions. You can bring to each letter whatever you want. So I'm going to tag Celia, Bookish North, Dane at Dane Reads, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. Who else am I going to tag? I'm going to tag Jasmine Reeds. Jasmine, let's see what you can do with this. Okay, and of course anyone who wants to do it can do it. As I say, it's a really good tag to do because it's so open-ended. Okay, thanks very much. Till next time.